used to remember how, when getting ready for school, I used to wake up alone. I would want to have breakfast alone, got dressed alone, and finally went to the bus alone. You might be wondering, where were my parents? Well, they were mostly helping my brother get ready for school. They dress him, wake him up, feed him his breakfast, and constantly have their full, undivided attention on him. This often led to me having less attention than I would have wanted, as I quickly learned to do all of the things that my brother did, just without the aid of my parents. I learned to not be a bother to my family, just so that I could make more room for my brother. Hi, I'm Alvaro de la Mora, and I've lived with my brother Mateo for most of my life. Mateo has ADHD, which is a learning disability that stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which makes him not be able to concentrate and be distracted all day. Mateo's disability also manifests in other ways, such as sensory disintegration. For example, he hates the feeling of putting sunscreen on, often getting irritated by it and causing a fit. Now imagine how much of a hassle it was for my parents to put it on him when we were little. Whatever you thought about, it was worse. Because of my brother's disability, most of my parents' focus revolved around him. Whenever he would get stressed, my parents would naturally try to help him and calm him down. This happened a lot. So, while growing up, I was usually under my brother's immense, ADHD-ridden shadow. I normalized living in the shadow, which then stunted how I grew as an individual, as I was just Mateo's brother, not Alvaro. Quite frankly, this made me resent my brother and parents a lot, as I craved to have the attention that my brother constantly got. It also didn't help that I was being pushed to do things that only my brother wanted to do. If Mateo was going on a horseback riding trip for the whole summer, I was going too, further erasing the few bits of individuality that I had. A term commonly used to describe people with a similar situation, someone who lives with a sibling that has a developmental disability that is, such as ADHD, Down syndrome, specific eating disorders, depression, or anxiety, is called glass child. This seemingly incoherent title makes quite a lot of sense when contextualized, though. The term comes from how siblings under these circumstances are often looked through and ignored, as people are too busy helping the other child deal with, objectively, harder situations. But this often leads to glass children being neglected in a key developmental stage of their lives, yielding many consequences to their emotional upbringing. Being a glass child manifests in depression and anxiety, as it makes people internalize their problems. By doing so, it is common for these children to be unable to process or express emotions correctly. Growing up a glass child also makes higher standards, as people are expected to not be as difficult to maintain as a sibling that has a developmental disability, and, just like glass, appear stronger than they actually are. These standards are placed since they are little, and as time goes on, stress starts to accumulate because these standards are withheld. The hard part, though, is that these standards are often not achievable, but only relative to the other sibling's hardships. Because a sibling is dealing with these incredibly difficult situations, the other one that isn't must be this perfect, problem-free child, which often isn't the case. If you think that this phenomenon only happens with certain developmental disabilities, or that it is uncommon, you would be incorrect. There are many manifestations of glass children, all with different levels of severity. According to the worldwide burden of infant mental health and emotional disorder, reported the task force of the World Association for Infant Mental Health, around 20% of the world's population has some sort of developmental disability. Out of that 20%, 10% has ADHD. That is around 1,300,000 people. Now imagine how many of these people have siblings. Suddenly, my situation sounds a little less rare, right? In my own experience, growing up a glass child made me lack a lot of emotional maturity, which was crucial to my upbringing. It also really manifested through my lack of individuality, which was a huge problem for me up until a few years ago. Throughout my life, I lived vicariously through my brother, celebrating his successes, mourning his defeats, and learning from his mistakes and scolds from my parents. Basically, I was living my life through the echoes of what people said to my brother, not to me. To start, I would rarely get any scolds or critiques from my parents, which may seem great, as I was being seen as this perfect child who didn't have the same struggles as my brother. But it was nothing like that at all. Like many other glass children, being seen as the better or perfect child made me be completely seen through and ignored when any problems of mine actually did arise, as they were overshadowed by my brother's struggles and deemed less important, both by my family and by me. For example, I wasn't the most tolerable person in the world, with things outside of my comfort zone being out of the question all of the time. I didn't realize this was a problem I faced up until a few years ago, when my parents actually started to call me out on some of my behavior. This made me feel very frustrated about my situation, especially because, as a young boy, I didn't understand it at all. Why was it that my parents were scolding me and making me feel like I was doing things wrong, but I wasn't getting any sort of feedback on it? This left me confused, angry, and without any real understanding of what was going on. Because I was so young, I lacked the emotional maturity to look at how complex everything was, and to realize how the people around me were also living through it. For example, when we would go on Mateo's horseback riding trips for the whole summer, never once considering that, maybe I would have liked to go somewhere other than North Carolina. This made me feel very neglected, as I believed my parents were making me do things that only my brother wanted to do. This was partially correct, and I soon realized that the situation was more nuanced than that. As time went on, with the help of therapy and talking with my own therapist, Violeta Hinojosa, who also helped me gather information for this talk, I started to learn and understand my situation better. I started to realize how complicated and complex everything was, and that my parents and brother lived through it as well. It wasn't that my parents were ignoring me, it's just that they had to protect my brother in order for him to survive a world that is way harsher on him than it is to me. And my brother was not actively scheming against me in order to steal the spotlight. He was just born with a condition that demanded more attention than usual. I started to realize that, although my situation isn't the best, it's the one I was born into, so there's no need to wallow. Instead, I decided to grow and mature. With this, I noticed that it was time for some change, and that it was necessary for me to look for who Alvaro was, not who Mateo's brother was. I started to develop my own hobbies and things I like and dislike. I ditched horseback riding, which used to be both me and my brother's central sport, and dove into swimming. I started to notice that I love chemistry, and that it is a subject that I would like to study later on in my life. The way I handle social situations also changed, as I started to notice that I could also have friends and be loud and funny, since I always was these things. Just that it took me understanding that I was my own person for all of this to come out into the surface. Overall, I grew to understand that my story and experience were just as important and valid as my brother's. My resentment toward my parents and brother is gone. We have talked about our circumstances, and we have normalized a previously hard topic to discuss. Don't worry, this is not a truth bomb for my family. They know. So, I don't want this talk to seem like a sob story about how my life was awful and how you should pity me. On the contrary, it works as a call to action on an issue that is rarely talked about, but so many people live through. Finally, I want to end on a positive note, in which I talk about where my brother and I are. For starters, my brother, who wasn't that successful during his time here, has proven all the teachers who undermined him and made him think he was dumb wrong by going on to study political sciences in the ITAM. Mateo has also matured a lot when it comes to his ADHD, and has now been able to process his emotions a lot better and not demand as much attention from my parents as he used to. As for me, I have now been able to become an individual, something that I hadn't been for years. After talking with my parents about our situation, I have been able to process my situation healthily, to the point where I am sharing it with everyone here. For years, I hated talking, especially public speaking. An example of how, growing up, I put myself on the sidelines in order to give space for my brother. But now, I am up here speaking to all of you. I'm facing many of my childhood fears today. As I confront them head on, I view this as one of the final steps in becoming my own person and escaping my brother's shadow. And I'm not the exception. Every glass child here and around the world has a story that matters, just as much as the siblings or anyone else's. Trust me, even if it seems insignificant to you and the people around you, trust me, it's important. My biggest hope and dream for this talk is that it is able to change somebody, either in the audience or some distant acquaintance of somebody here, and how they view their life, spiraling into them sharing their stories, and this conversation continuing. With this, I ask everyone that is here with me today or listening to look inward and think, do I relate to this story? Is there anyone in my life that could relate to this? If so, engage in conversations. That is the most important thing to do when tackling this problem and would help normalize this problem. With this, I can finally say that the person on stage today is not Mateo's brother, but Alvaro. Thank you.